We all know Black is beautiful. You know, well, now you do. Black is excellent, too. In me, in you. Black is shiny and new. And black is older than Earth. All at the same damn time. Black is sweet. Black is ours. Black is love. Black is God. God is us.
Peace, greetings, and welcome to BoleKaja, Diasporic Pan-African Discourse, a conversation series hosted by the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA. It features experts in Pan-African studies discussing diasporic Pan-African issues and experiences in keeping with the mission of the Department of Pan-African Studies as the intellectual arm of the revolution. The discussions in this conversation series pulsate with the ingenuity and agency of the diasporic African people and are instructive in both ongoing and impending struggles to envision and create an alternative diasporic African future, an authentic freedom and human dignity. Today's conversation will feature Dr. Nana Lawson Bush V, Chair of the Pan-African Studies Department at California State University, Los Angeles, and the former Director of the University of California, Irvine, and Cal State Los Angeles Joint Doctoral Program in Urban Educational Leadership. Rooted in Pan-Africanism, Nana Dr. Bush employs a Pentecostal revolutionary pedagogy, teaching from and to the spirit to foster a liberatory praxis. His approach to teaching is reflected in his research as he aims to contemporaneously disrupt power relations and to build programs, institutions, and states on the best of African philosophies and practices. Also in conversation with us is Dr. Nicole Vines, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of Africana Studies at California State University Channel Islands and former Professor in the Department of Pan-African Studies at California State University Los Angeles. Dr. Vines earned her Ph.D. in Ethnic Studies from the University of California, Riverside, in which her research focuses on self-determination, strategies for Black identity formation, and historical African educational systems. What I would like to do, just before we get too far into our conversation, I don't want to assume that everyone has a sense of what fugitive pedagogy is. So what I want to do is show a brief video of one of the authors of the text of Fugitive Pedagogy, Jarvis Givens. He's a professor out of Harvard who earned his PhD out of Cal Berkeley in Africana Studies. So we'll watch a brief 5-minute video just to kind of contextualize what we'll be discussing to kind of give everyone a base knowledge, and then we'll go in discussion from there.
Left to Black. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, longtime host, and we are joined today by Professor Jarvis R. Givens, assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. And he's the author of Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, which was published in 2021 by Harvard University Press. Of Fugitive Pedagogy, Henry Giroux writes, "It is a brilliant, inspiring, and an energizing book that reclaims narratives of critique and hope that fueled the deep grammar of pedagogical struggle that unfolded in both the experiences and narratives of Black educators in the beginning of the 20th century and beyond." Welcome to Left to Black, Professor Givens.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. This is a really amazing book. I know for me, from my own personal reading of it, it really does recover Carter G. Woodson as a radical figure. You know, there are ways in which, the image of Carter G. Woodson has been flattened over the years, and we just simply think about him in the context of being the father of Black History Month and Negro History Week, and everybody talks about, the miseducation of the Negro, but you really unfold a really compelling figure and give us, much deeper context for the scholar that he became and the radical figure that he became. But you start the book not with Carter G. Woodson, but this figure of Tessie McGee, who you describe in the beginning of the book and throughout as really a great example of what you call fugitive teaching. Talk a little bit about who Tessie McGee was.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. Tessie McGee was a teacher at the Webster Parish Training School. And the opening scenario of the book that you're referring to is taking place in the early 1930s, where Tessie McGee is secretly reading to her high school class of students at the Webster Parish Training School from Carter G. Woodson's textbook that she keeps concealed in her lap underneath the desk. And then the student recalls someone coming into the classroom, and he says she stopped reading from the book and began reading from the required outline that she was supposed to teach from based on the local kind of school board. And then the student says when the door closes and the person leaves, her eyes went back to the book in her lap. For me, that was, when I came across that story, it really opened my eyes to the extraordinary work that ordinary Black teachers were doing in Black schools across this country. And that to understand the significance of Carter G. Woodson, we also had to understand this world of Black teachers that he was a part of, right? That he was a student, because he himself had once been a student in, rural Black classrooms in Virginia, being taught by his formerly enslaved uncles. And that story about Tessie McGee just forced me to imagine a new way of talking about the way Black teachers navigated power in the context of Jim Crow schools. And Tessie McGee just became the perfect embodiment of that. And I wanted to open the book with her telling that story, because Woodson is also present in the context of his textbook that she's using. But in order to really appreciate that story, we have to take into account the social history that gave it meaning, right? And so using Tessie McGee as this kind of window to kind of open the story became very important for me, because it wasn't just about Woodson. It was about this pedagogical tradition he was the product of, and that he helped to expand through his work.
So I just wanted to, again, provide a working foundation for our discussion and this idea of fugitive pedagogy. And I think Jarvis Givens, of course, provides a pristine example of that in the ideations of Tessie McGee and how she was able to subvert, oppressive forms and still be able to provide this really dynamic and liberatory form of pedagogy. So let's jump into it a little bit further. And one of the things that was kind of really resonated with me is the fact that he's mentioning everyday teachers, right? These are not like teachers who are at the upper echelons of things or anything of that nature. These are your regular, everyday, what we call quotidian teachers. And so if we could maybe speak to this importance of the quotidian, the importance of the everyday as it speaks to the role of this type of pedagogy and the importance of this notion of fugitive pedagogy. Dr. Vines, we can start with you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here. Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting about this when we're talking about this notion of the everyday teacher, right? One of the things that really sort of grounds Woodson's understanding, right, is his own family, his uncles, right, who are teaching at these Reconstruction schools, really trying to give foundation to the Black community. And then when he leaves and he goes and he begins to work in the coal mines, there's a man, Oliver Jones, I think his name was, as mentioned in the book, who basically just opens up his home to Black coal miners to be able to come together and to think and talk, right? And sort of, talk these things out, talk what's happening out. And I think in traditional society, we wouldn't consider those men to be considered intellectual, but they totally were, right? They were this sort of everyday intellectual who was involved in what was going on in the community and really wanted to be able to demonstrate that, right?
Yeah, that's a really
so, complicating what we think about as the intellectual. I think that's one of the things that, what this book helps me understand.
Absolutely, thank you. Dr. Bush, how would you frame this idea of the quotidian educator?
Yeah, we have an agreement in Pan-African Studies that we will not start our history, we won't start our classes with enslavement or the oppression of Black folk. And so to really understand fugitive pedagogy, to really understand what's going on in the classroom, we have to understand this within a context of ongoing historical efforts by African people throughout time to educate themselves. When he goes on in this video, he says what we see in the classroom cannot be totally explained by the term fugitive or subversive education. He almost talks about it like almost like mysteriously. There is something else happening in this space, but he doesn't seem to have the language and the history to put it into context to talk about what else he is seeing in this classroom. There's a book by Maya Angelou who says, "I know why the caged bird sings." And the answer to that question really isn't that deep. The caged bird sings because it's a bird, and that's what birds do. They sing. African people educate themselves because that's what African people have always done. And so you have African people who gave birth to the world's first educational systems in Africa. In ancient Kemet, or what you might know as Egypt, this is where the first education, the first colleges emerged, studying everything under the sun. But this continues all throughout Africa, all into Axiom, all through in Zimbabwe, all the way to Timbuktu, where you had people from all over the world coming to Africa to study. They would fake their resumes to come study with African people, so African people know nothing else but to create educational institutions and to teach. And so you can put a frame around that like jail or oppression or enslavement now and call that fugitive, but it's not that really. It is what African people do. So when African people are captured and on these ships, these are people who have memorized the whole Quran. These are teachers, these are institutional builders, these are educators. They come to the United States where they can be killed to read, yet they establish schools deep in the woods of Africa, deep in the woods of the South, learning how to read and to write when they could be killed to do so. So African people were merely doing what African people do. And so when we enter the scene in the South in the 1920s, 1930s, we continue this African educational system, but to the untrained eye, it looks just like resistance. And it's that too, but it's merely an attempt by African people to reclaim their African traditions, which appears to be subversive, which appears to be fugitive, and in many respects, it is. But if you only see it through that frame, as the brother said himself, it does not totally explain the mystery of what he sees in the classroom. And so for us, resistance, by definition for us, is an opportunity or a chance for African people to reclaim them African selves. And I don't know that completely fits the definition of resistance, but that's how people sort of miss really what's going on. Like the brother himself said, this cannot completely explain what I see in the classroom.
So I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about even the question I posed, and really, to your point, that's the reason why the quotidian teacher is carrying on this tradition is because it's nothing abnormal or abstract. It's just normative. It's innate. It's what we do, right? So it makes sense that this will be infused into every aspect of Blackness, right? And how we go about our educational tradition is part of our educational tradition. So that's a very, very brilliant point and profound point.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to take away from the courage,
right,
of these people who are doing this when they can lose their job or their lives, or their schools can be burned down. Because African education in the United States is still today, and then under attack. So they would just simply kill the teachers or burn the school down. And so we definitely have to give that respect, that this teacher who is hiding the book could lose her job. And how many of us today, right now, are willing to hide the book and lose our jobs?
And I think too, right?
Yeah, and
go ahead, Dr. Ron.
I was just going to say, right, and to really connect to that, one of the things that he says is that resistance is, it doesn't explain it, right? Like it's not enough to explain it, that it's really drawing on this longer history that, that Dr. Bush alluded to, right?
Yeah, and I was thinking about within the text and this, claim that she could very well lose her job, and the stakes of that were so broad to where her boss, for example, the principal, would be in trouble, and there'd be grave applications for him. And the claim is made within the text that the principal was in on the gig, right? And he was actually testing her to make sure that if a administrator would have you were to walk in your classroom, would you be able to hide the book in time to not catch their eye? So part of this speaks to the pervasiveness of this, what is framed as fugitive pedagogy, but what we now know is a continuum of African education, right? How even those in power were in on this gig for certain percent, right? Like, I don't say they wasn't in power, like we're manipulating the whole system, but your principles and things of that nature, they were in on this practice of what we're calling fugitive pedagogy. And this kind of speaks to like what we call like a professional black code, right? Where like everybody within this social milieu was on code with how we're going to enact and embody this act of fugitive pedagogy.
I think what else is that we got to pull out of this, we're not just saying, you know, education. This was education at the highest level. These schools, other people were very jealous of the education, the educational attainment of these schools. And some of it is because, one, Black people are brilliant. Two, you have people that are now graduating with PhDs and other degrees with no other means to employment. And so your history teacher could be Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Your chemistry teacher could be any well-known PhD person in the field, because they could not work and teach anywhere else. So of course they had the best teachers, the best curriculum, and then produced the best students in the world.
Very, very brilliant.
And I think additionally to that, right, like one of the things that he talks about and we really learned from the book is the way that community was created, right? So it wasn't just that the principal was in on it. It was that, I think the book mentioned that like a couple of teachers, they lived together, right? And including the principal, right? And so they were really forming this cadre of Black thought, right? That spilled over, I would say, into the physical classroom space, but it was something that was created within community, right?
And I think too, like, especially this idea and this notion of community, it becomes important when you look at Carter G. Woodson himself, because he wasn't one to separate himself from the community. His work was very much about being involved with the everyday. Even as he obtained his PhD, right, he was still working with the K through 12 educators. So he's seen no distinction or bifurcation between those two units. And I think that's important because in our contemporary space, right, you see that separation, and he didn't believe in that.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you, Dr. Vines. We know early in his life, he worked in the coal mine with some older gentlemen who could not read. And so they would sit together and he would read for them. He saw this as his duty. And then he actually promised these coal miners, he said, later, I'm going to write and publish about your story. And he does so. He lives amongst the community. His office is right there, was right there in the community. And he lived in his office. And people would come into the office, really into his home. So he also lived in proximity with the people as well. And there's many more other examples of this. When he died, all the number of school children who wrote to him saying, thank you for taking us out for ice cream. Thank you for spending time with us. And so he was completely immersed in the community. At the same time, he was an extreme academic mind, a brilliant erudite in every sense in terms of being a scholar. What he writes and what he's thinking about, it's hard to really comprehend, get your head around how bright he really was. Yet he spent his time with children, with elders in the community. And also just this notion of some of the teachers lived together.
Yeah.
Wow, let that sit in for a moment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really deep, because, and what I'm also hearing, like, there has to be the connection to the community, and we can't, just sit up and occupy the ebony tower, so to speak. And it's making me think about the work of Fred Moten and this idea of the undercommons, like the spaces outside of the institution where knowledge is produced. And to me, especially when you're talking about a continuum of African education, you can't really talk about African education and leave out like the Bush education, right? So these undercommon type of spaces, they become really important. You know, what is the education going on within the juke joint? What's the education going on at the pulpit, right? So we have to really begin to, this work allows us to expand our thinking of valid spaces of epistemology beyond just the classroom, you know.
Absolutely. So, you know, for our students on here, I mean, what I would ask my children when I would drop them off to school is, you know, why are you going to school? Yeah. What are you doing this for? And we know, you know, from the work of Carter G. Woodson, one of his most famous pieces was miseducation of the Negro. And that we would go to school to be trained to work for somebody else. And so I was trying to impress upon my own children that you are going to school to work for African people. And so these students, our students at Cal State LA, you have to begin to ask yourself this question: why are you going to school? And if this schooling process doesn't put you in closer proximity to your own people and solving your own problems, then you need to leave school. Or find a program like Pan-African Studies that we hopefully puts you more in proximity to the problems faced in your own families, your own households, and your own communities. Or you're gonna work to solve other folks' problems. And it's clear that Carter G. Woodson, the purpose of his education was to solve the problems of the African world. And so students, as you already are in your classes, or even right now on this call, I don't know if you ever asked yourself, why are you going to school? And so begin to ask yourself every day, why am I studying? Why am I going to school, and for who, and who is it going to serve?
Dr. Bonds, if I could pull you in, what are your thoughts in this regards to, you know, occupying spaces outside the classroom, the purpose of education, the why behind, you know, this practice?
Yeah, I think, right, like, you know, people talk about the space of the barbershop, right? And how people are getting education in these spaces, that we have to, in a lot of ways, be subversive about the way that we share our knowledge, right? And I think those spaces outside the university or the institution are the ways in which we do that. You know, one of the critiques that Woodson was saying was like, you know, what good is it to sit up here and learn about European history and, right, all these different things if it is not informing who you are to be a better person, right, to then come back to your community. So I think these spaces, even things like what we're doing right now, right, these things are pivotal to us understanding ourselves and us furthering our own mission, because who else is going to do it for us, right? Nobody. It has to be us.
Yeah, that's beautiful, especially this idea of subversiveness, right? And like, to understand that, yes, we're within the institution, but we're simultaneously almost working against the institution, you know? And I think Woodson provides a brilliant example of that, because early in his career, he's taking, you know, in funding from these white philanthropists, and it begins to cause tension because they try to control his mission, right? And he quickly realizes the need to subvert one, their funding, and allow himself a little bit more autonomy. And I think what's really fecund is, while he subverts their funding, he goes to the community and he finds funding sufficient for allowing him to really expand his operation. So I think, Dr. Vines, when you talk about this idea of subversiveness, it's also, for me, important to tie it to a faith in our people, because oftentimes we're afraid to be subversive because we don't want to be left out in the cold, right? But I think Woodson provides us with a really pristine example of how your community can support you when you need that support.
You know, thinking about this, I went and I reread Milton's Undercommons, right? And one of the things that he says that, you know, we may find the university space as a place of refuge, but for us to never accept it as a place of enlightenment.
Right. In fact, he says that the only rational relationship to the university is to steal. And steal again, right? So that's the act of subversion, right? How do we steal space? This right here is us stealing space and university resources to do undercommon subversive work, you know. And Dr. Bush, I know you occupy a very auspicious role as the chair of the department, so you also have to play that dance and the balance and mitigate, you know, institutionalism. So how does that kind of play out for you?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. What I try to do is eliminate the dance as much as possible. There is no dance. So I speak from clearly who I am and let the institution have to deal with that. You know, of course, sometimes you know, some compromise here and there, but it's really not a dance. You have to stand firmly on your purpose. Just like I said to students in terms of why are you at school? Why am I the chair? What is my function? What is my relationship to the university? I have to be clear whose team I'm on, right? All the time in all ways. And when I move that way, then I can bend the university towards my will. I can build the institution towards my will. And to the point where we can't get along the intersect, then I know where I got to step off and keep moving. But if you stand firmly on who you are, oh, you can get much space in the university without much resistance many times.
I think that's a very important thing, and I kind of frame that same discussion with the students that I come in contact with around this idea of code switching, right? Like, why are we so quick to take on a different posture to make someone else feel comfortable? Why are we willing to, you know, shorten our name or take on a nickname when they can say Dostoevsky and they can say Kant and they can say all these different names, European names, right? So why are we so quick to acquiesce to their comfort, right? Nah, make them bend to us. And fundamentally, from a historical standpoint, right, that's order. That's biotic, right? I mean, as you mentioned, they had to come to us to learn.
Yes.
So why do we have to continue to make them comfortable? It's out of pocket.
Yeah, I think that crystallized my statement more in terms of why you come to school. First of all, you got to understand who you are. And when you talk about that, it just creates order, given that African people were the first to introduce education, the African people were the first on the planet, then understanding who you are, then therefore talking about why you're going to school, then that brings what I'm saying just a little more clear to everybody. So thank you for that, yes.
You know, I'm always curious of the contemporary and a lot of the cultural studies training and even the work of Fanon tells you to be attentive to your now, be responsible to your present. So Dr. Vaughn, I'm thinking about this work of Fugitive Pedagogy. What does that look like in our contemporary? What does that look like in our moment now?
Can you go to Dr. Bush on that one first? Because I struggle with that question.
Okay, for sure. Dr. Bush, how do you see, and maybe let me reframe it from maybe not fugitive pedagogy, but the continuum of African pedagogical production. How do you see that manifesting itself now?
Yeah, so thank you. So one of the things I learned about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, he mentored so many people. I mean, he took time to really spend time with PhDs and K-12. So I'm looking at the two of you all that I played some role in development in terms of getting their PhDs, knowing that what the institution is going to be to sort of create this pipeline or this underground railroad where we're going to help you. We don't have to be officially on your committee. We don't have to be in none of that, but you are ours. And we're going to help you through this process. To me, in terms of how he would articulate it, that's fugitive or subversive pedagogy or mentoring. And so there's many examples that are abounding, but just looking at the two of you as representations of that. Now Dr. Vines is now at another university. So being subversive, carrying on the gospel, if you will, of Pan-Africanism. That's subversive education at its best.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well said. Dr. Vine?
So it's putting a sister on blast to finish her PhD after it took her a while to get there?
Absolutely. Knowing the power that you're going to have to create other spaces. That's why, so it wasn't just for you. We were doing this for the good of African people. So having you with your PhD at another space is good for us all.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So, I mean, I think, you know, if I can add to that, you know, I was hired at this new institution to create Black studies, right? Wow. It's helping to shape the discipline. It's helping to shape our future students. it's helping to hopefully be able to get into that position to start mentoring students again, right, in this particular discipline, and see them go off to become PhDs and things like that. So I think, I think that's one of the ways that we see this fugitive pedagogy working through ourselves today.
Yeah, I think what Dr. Bush mentioned as far as the mentorship is true, and I sit as an embodiment of that. In fact, where I'm going to get my PhD, he's an alumni, right? So like that's how strong the connection of this mentorship goes. But for me, like, and those who are in my course, they know this, like everything I do within the classroom is subversive and is fugitive, and it's to undermine how they understand or what they think education should be like, first pointing out the distinction between what education is and what schooling is, and then letting them know through this distinction, everything that you understand to be schooling is wrong, and let me show you another way to go about that, staying in line with the work of the discipline to do what's called critique and corrective, right? So I'm going to point out the faults in your education. And here's the thing, everybody know it. Like if you've been through a K through 12 system in this country, it's messed up, right? There's no doubt about that. So it's not really too hard to critique that. But what the important work is the corrective, right? And kind of ironing out the kinks and doing the really foundationally the healing work that's necessary to kind of mitigate the harm that's been done within these K through 12 institutions, especially on African people, because these are systems that are very harmful and violent towards us, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and all the nine, So I definitely see the continuation of this work, this fugitive pedagogy work. And I think too, it's become now to where it's spatial, right? So if you look in Florida, how your fugitive pedagogy work may look and feel a little bit different than how it is in California, but it's fugitive nonetheless, and a part of me doesn't even want to give too much time to the oppressor's bullshit, but I do also want to recognize that, like, this is a real actual affront or continued affront on our ability to educate ourselves, right? Like to outlaw AP African-American studies, that's a very aggressive affront to our educational process. And there's no games about it. Like, to me, that's an educational act of war, right? But again, I don't know how we can address that if you want to, but if you can move on, I get that too, because I don't want to, give them too much of our time.
Yeah, no, I mean, they are currently looking at, I think they have just passed the law where students can't even bring their own library books, right? So it's not just at the systemic level, right? It is at this personal level where it's really trying to control. It's trying to control what and how we think. And so, yeah, it definitely is. And and think about it. They're not outlawing, I mean, they're critiquing critical race theory, right? But they're specifically attacking African-American AP, African-American studies AP courses, right? So here we go again, we're being singled out for our education, right? Because of the liberatory aspects of our education, right?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting under this false notion of let's not make them uncomfortable. Like I sat in those chairs and they had no problem making me feel uncomfortable at all, but it's just a certain segment of people we want, but that's how what they call white fragility works. Yeah. One thing I do want to kind of shift gears, and I'm thinking about how the flyer of this event was constructed, and I offer an image of Carter G. Woodson, but also an image of Anna Julia Cooper, who was a very big part of that educational milieu that embody this fugitive pedagogy. Jarvis Gibbons in the text, he talks about Tessie McGee, a Black woman teacher, right? How do we place or bring women's role in this fugitive pedagogy in the conversation? Or furthermore, how do we kind of articulate Woodson's interrelationships with women and how he sought to work with women? Dr. Vine?
So one of the things I think is really important to ground is the foundation, right? We know that Woodson's mother, when she was 13 years old, her enslaver runs into financial trouble, is going to sell her mother and her younger brothers. And so she offers herself up as this sort of sacrifice, right? And I think him hearing that story being told and passed down, he understood, right, the sacrifice that this woman was making for him. Later in the book, we realized that, in the 1900s, over 86% of teachers were Black women, right? And I think when we're talking about Anna Julia Cooper, we also need to talk about the importance of the M Street School in DC, right? Who had two female principals, both, I can't remember the first one's name, but right, Anna Julia Cooper, they both get fired, right? And, you know, then his relationship with Mary McLeod Bethune, right? So women are definitely influencing. And I think he is allowing and giving them space to, right, be the leaders and the teachers and the first mothers that they are.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful segue, and I would like to kind of pick up on this idea of the first mother. And Dr. Bush, if you kind of speak to this notion of a woman as the first mother and this role that they played in this African educational practice.
Yeah, I mean, from ancient time to even, you know, present, it was understood that even that time in the womb, but even going, you know, back farther than that, just being a girl child, and at that girl child stage, you are actually carrying the future within you. And so women and girls were treated with that understanding that the future of the African world was already present in the girls, and what they're taking in their minds and their bodies that they're already teaching or feeding in to the future seeds. And certainly when they began to carry them in the womb and birth them, that the mother is indeed the first teacher, maybe even their last teacher, when you really think about it. So that notion carries strong in terms of who becomes teachers here in the United States, will be largely women. So not to think about and include and allow space for women to be the lead in the African educational experience would greatly hurt African people. And Woodson seems to understand this. He funds the work of Zora Neale Hurston. So these are other examples of that. He absolutely affirmed African women in the educational space. That's all I would say at the moment on that, but yeah.
You know, I'm going to kind of work my way to Dr. Vines and make this connect to this idea of you know, African women's empowerment. But I'm thinking about one, Woodson's relationships to like Howard's University and some of his issues that we could call Woodson had with their respectability politics, right? And how even if you're thinking about the thesis of the miseducation of the Negro, implicitly in that you can kind of pick up some elements of respectability politics, right? As you ascend higher up these educational ranks, the more alienated you become from your community. A large part of respectability politics is trying to create this very proper depiction of Blackness, which is why, right, it was Rosa Parks was chosen to be the person to embody the bus boycott. So could you speak to me, Dr. Vine, and problematize for me the role women played in this respectability politics and how we could kind of problematize or poke holes in these notions of respectability politics?
Yeah, right. So when we think of respectability politics, it is typically this face of trying to appease to whiteness, right? And one of the things that I really want to push back on that with is one of the reasons respectability politics comes about is because you have this, you know, group of white men who are basically just attacking Black women, right? They are attacking the characters of Black women. And so they wanted to, you know, what Michelle Obama says, when they go low, we go high, right? So they thought that going high and really sort of really demonstrating who they were as women would change the way Black people in society was were being seen, right? And so with politics of respectability, we have to really look at it as a concerted strategy, right? This was something that they came up with as a strategy so that they could change the way that they were being perceived in society. You know, the Association of the National Association of Colored Women, right? They come about in 1896. Remember, this is also when Plessy versus Ferguson is decided upon. And so it's like, what can we do as Black women to really change our situation in society? And so, you know, thinking about it, like I said, as the strategy, it becomes this concerted effort that they're going to pour everything into this to be able to navigate this space, right? This terrain. And, you know, one of the things that we had talked about was this notion around disidentification, right? And so that's a term that Brittany Cooper talks about in her book, Beyond Respectability. All right, and disidentification was, you know, I'm going to identify with the things that I see as being able to benefit me in life and not associate myself with certain things that, you know, it's not going to benefit me. So, you know, again, I think looking at this as a strategy, right? Not always that they necessarily 100% face forward believed in these things, but they saw it as an effective means to just be able to claim who they were as Black women.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because when we discussed that, when we were kind of discussing this discussion, you know, it kind of caught me back because for me, I'm always been against respectability politics, right? I'm like, yo, I'm gonna just do me, and yeah, later for you. Like, I that's just not how I've ever been operated. And I do see the backlash and the pushback that it does produce operating that way, and I can see how operating from the standpoint of respectability politics could be beneficial, right? But just for me, that my disposition has always been just to I'm gonna go against the grain. But I think to kind of reframe it from a standpoint as a strategy, it puts a different lens on it. And for me, it even makes me think about code switching in a different context is also a survival mechanism, as a strategy for survival. But I'm gonna still encourage to push back against that, right? From a standpoint of you know, code switching, like you would be surprised what you can get away with being yourself, you know.
Exactly. I mean, Carter, Woodson seems to sort of be what you're describing about yourself. He just doesn't get along really with a whole lot of folks, which that's maybe a longer conversation. But you know, he's at Howard just for a short period of time. He just can't do the institution. He goes to another institution, be the dean. When he leaves that, he does take some funding early on from white folks, but then he says, no, we can't do that. And then he begins to really go after organizations and Black people who are taking funding for Black people. And we later, you know, just see the problem of that, even with, he writes the first textbook and it's completely funded by Black people and so forth. But of course, white people come along with the press and they fund another brother, I believe it's Franklin, and he writes this textbook that now that money is not being circulated back into the Black community and largely becomes the book of the school system. But had he, you know, everybody stuck with the plan of using our own text and our own publishing, how much more would that have benefited our people? So he doesn't seem to be too much into the respectability politics and would call out his own people who seem to be going that route as a strategy. Now, what we don't know is this, just like the administrator and the teacher may have been working together on this strategy, we don't know behind closed doors. We had some people go do the, you know, you all go do the respectability politics while we be over here doing this, because our people were brilliant, had all kinds of strategies. And what I hear with Dr. Vines also maybe suggesting that this was a part of a total plan. And so we have to take that into account as well.
And I think that right there, for me, it became a brilliant way of looking at Martin and Malcolm, right? And they try to pin that dichotomy. But one way of looking at that is, well, you can take Mountain's route if you want, but if not, you don't want to acquiesce to that, then we got this one coming too. So they're really working in tandem. And I think this is really what you're both elucidating to and to me, this also speaks to the importance of Pan-Africanism, right? Because what Pan-Africanism allows you to do, instead of focusing on the things that separate us, right? Like over 114 languages in Africa. So theoretically, right, that's vast division, but there's so much cultural continuity within those 114 languages. Pan-Africanism allows you to look at those connections. And to me, as a project of dialectics, right? Like, yes, you could notice that there's twos in everything, but a dialectical project also is not to always focus on the disunity, because Western world has us really focused on othering. But from a dialectical project, look at how things bring us together.
Yeah, and I don't know, you know, on what things the people in this era agreed or disagreed upon, that question of why they went to school, there was a collective agreement that education was for freedom and freedom was education. It was a mantra that they openly said, and that was a part of them. And so they may have had disagreements, but what they did agree on, education for freedom and freedom for education.
You know, and we spoke to this a little bit, but I think, you know, why not take another opportunity to talk some shit, right? And I think Dr. Vine's growth is an extension of the work that Pan-African Studies is doing, but like, if we could kind of speak to that explicitly, right? Like, how is the department embodying this work? How is the department expanding this work? Or how is this department complicating this work by offering it not as fugitive pedagogy, right, but as a continuation of African education? Dr. Vine, if you don't mind, I would like to start with you.
I'm sorry, could you reframe that for me? I'm not understanding.
One, I'm talking about the work that the department does, and you operate as an extension of the department, right? And I would like to speak to how your extension, how your personal research and how your personal work continues this work of fugitive pedagogy or continues African continuum of education. And again, you can speak from it for how your personal research does, how your time in the department has kind of informed your personal research, however you so choose to approach that. That makes sense?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, right. So I think, you know, my work focuses primarily on the Black people in the United States, right? But I think one of the things that we also see with that is that it was not just what we consider Black Americans who are developing our understanding. You have people like Arthur Schomburg, right? You have people from the Caribbean, right? You know, you have the influence of Martin Delaney's parents, right? To think about all the ways in which the diaspora is really informing our understanding around Black studies. And so for me personally, you know, moving to a new institution, which is demographically a little different than I'm used to, you know, one of the things I do find myself thinking about and trying to be conscious and mindful of is that, you know, one, I am always going to tell my truth, right? I'm going to tell the truth of the work and tell the truth of what, you know, what my education determines. But also, I do notice myself sort of censoring a little bit, because in certain aspects, it's like certain things are not worth the fight, right? Right, untenured, not worth the fight, right? And so, you know, there are ways that you know, like I said, I'm going to continue to tell the truth, but I have to be conscious and think about the ways that I explain a particular truth, because not everybody can receive it, right?
Thank you. And Dr. Bush, I'm thinking about some of the work of the department. We have a master's program coming in the fall. We have MD Pass coming out. It's a lot of work that's coming out of this department, you know, and can you speak to how this work is, again, a continuum of the things that African people have always been doing?
Good. So, I mean, the motto of the department, first of all, what is the intellectual arm of the revolution? So that sets a particular tone. You know, what is the department? You ain't got to, you don't have to wonder too much when you hear that. And that's pretty rare in the academic space, that in the academy and institution, we're saying we're here to overthrow you.
Right. We're
here to disrupt your system and your practice as we sit in your space. So that's automatically going to put up us against them by just declaring that. Yet, you know, with the frames that I talked about earlier, you know, beyond a revolution, we were African people engaged in certain things. And we have to get back to not just focusing on being free, which we must focus on being free, let's be clear, but we also have to get back to what is nation building, get back to standing on who we are, because just fighting and just doing this can take you away. You begin to think that's who you are. And so part of the work of Pan-African Studies is to be the intellectual arm of the revolution, but also to be the healing space. So we began this program by breathing, by being intentional around healing. We have Professor Mitchell on here who has a yoga class to talk about the healing that should happen within Pan-African studies. We have, I think Dr. Ruman is still on, I'm not for certain, he was on earlier. We have MD Pass, which is saying that students are going to major and minor in Pan-African studies on their way to medical school and health professions, because of people that don't know how to heal themselves or have to go to the enemy to be healed will not be healed. You will be killed every time. And so you can't just say you're the revolutionary arm of the revolution and not have the components of nation building. And one of the key components is to have your own medical people. Then you got to next grow your own food. But before that, you also got to be whole. And before that, you got to know you in the fight, in the revolution. So it's not one or the other. It's all at once that we have to be engaged in. And so our work in the department is all of that and then some. And it's personal. So it's not just that we are this at work. You have to be this at home within your own families with your grandmothers and everybody that you're seeing in the neighborhood as well. So the work doesn't end just in the department. It carries wherever you go, that you have to create these African spaces, that you have to fight to expand the spaces that we can operate in and be free as possible.
Yeah, right. One thing that Moulton's article, right, the Undercommons article stated is like the university always has the impulse of the state, right? So how do we educate our students about the state and what's going on in the state, right? One of my things I talk about policing, right? And this idea that, oh, well, body cameras were going to change things, but we know it didn't, right? So what is the arm of the state from within the university that we have to educate our students so that they have a complete awareness of what's going on, within their communities, how they're being policed, how they're being surveilled. So I think that's one way that we see that definitely I practice this notion around fugitive pedagogy. Right?
Yeah, that's a good call out. Also, I want to offer the opportunity, if you have questions, audience members, please feel free to put them in the chat. We definitely want to engage your thoughts in the way that you're thinking about it. But what I do want to do is kind of triangulate your offering around policing and then this notion of us as healers. And this is something that really just hopped on my spirit as of last couple of weeks, and this notion of the spectacle lynching, right? And the historical phenomenon of placing these lynchings on display to one, affirm this notion, this false notion of white domination, but then also to keep keep people from being what's called matter out of place, right? To keep you in your projective roles, but also how the sharing of the spectacle and the sharing of the terror, where these things will become postcards and what have you, And I think about how the evolution of the spectacle has now gone beyond a postcard to hitting share on your phone. And we're now sharing these lynchings and creating the spectacle and reproducing the spectacle ourselves, and the trauma that's being spread as we spread this spectacle, right? And it doesn't allow for healing. And what made me think about this was this notion of the body camera, right? Because it's the idea that, oh, because we now know things will change. And this is the same reason why we reproduce the spectacle, because we think that if we share it, if we make awareness around it, it will create a change. But it's not that we don't know. Spectacle lynching has been going on for a very long time, right? So it's not about the awareness at this point. For me, and I could be wrong, but it's become more about reproducing the spectacle, reproducing and spreading the trauma. So I ask my students, don't do it. If you can help yourself, right? Don't open up that video. And some of us, we've already did it, right? But I know America, and there'll be another one, unfortunately. So when this opportunity represents itself, hold fast. So save yourself that trauma and don't open it. And then if you can't let curiosity get the best of you, you have to open it, then don't share it, right? Save someone else that trauma and not allow them to have to go through that, because at a certain level, we already know what's more important is what you're going to do about it.
Yeah, not that I, disagree at all. I think there's Ida B. Wells. She would go to the lynching. My God, and record it, you know, to bear witness. I can't imagine that, just being there, being Black, being a woman at a lynching. I have nothing within me to understand that type of agency and courage to do that. And, you know, perhaps that could be the role for some of us, to bear witness for that soul that is now being lynched or killed, for some of us. But for the majority of us, you know, probably not at this point. At this point, I definitely agree that it has been shown for a particular reason, because this was the same tactic they used. They would call everybody out, and they would take pregnant women and tie a horse to one leg and to the other and send that horse in different directions and rip that baby to the ground, to put a message of terror in you, that you begin to self-police yourself with the fear that they don't even have to police you, that you will have a terror and a white man inside of you that will police you yourself, that will control you yourself. And so, yes, that is going on. But things can happen for multiple reasons. That is definitely one of the reasons. So your advice is dead on. I just have a little caveat, like maybe that's the role of a few people, not the masses. But I could be absolutely wrong.
Yeah, I agree. Somebody
Yeah, I mean, I won't. I don't even watch them anymore, right? Because, like you said, what's the point? I think one of the things, and I talk about this with my students, is the way that violence just sort of get reproduced, right? So why does Mike Brown's body stay in the street for 4.5 hours? The same reason that those bodies were put in the town center, right, during these periods of lynching, to again keep people in a particular state of being subservient, right? Like Dr. Bush said, so that you're policing yourself, right? So I think I really agree with you with this idea. I think I want people to be knowledgeable, right? And I want people to stay knowledgeable about what's happening in society, but also, you don't need to see the violence to know that the violence is there.
At some point, it's also human nature to become immune to it. Just like, seeing violence on TV all the time, at some point, then you're not surprised about it. You're not up in arms. This is just what's going to happen. So again, they can serve multiple purposes as to why as well. And we become apathetic. This is just what happens to Black people. And then they add more, this is what happened to Black people who are thugs and criminals, because that's what they're going to say about us, or who smoke weed. They're going to put all of those things. And so it happens to them over there. Don't happen to us. And so we become more detached, but not just, it's human nature. You have to detach to stay sane.
Right. And I'm looking in the chat, Sister Mina is pointing out, prior to the cell phone, it was Rodney King, right? And that was shown ad nauseum repeatedly. And it's true. So it's not even at this point about technology, right? But yeah, so please, if you have questions or comments, throw those in the chat. If you can even feel free to raise your hand and volunteer your voice. We'd love to hear what you're thinking with the last 15 minutes that we have. One last question I did have, and I think implicitly we talked about this quite a bit, but what is the pedagogy? What is the social milieu? What is the environment that produces a Carter G. Woodson? And then for me, I'm thinking about that time frame. Not only a Carter G. Woodson, an Anna Julia Cooper, a W.E.B. Du Bois, and the list goes on and on and on. But what is the phenomenon like that produces this type of intellectual, this type of thought?
Yeah, that's a cold question. Something that you and I have talked about, something that I contemplate all the time. How do you get a man when they were told that there was no history for African people, that you are enslaved people, you are nothing else? His family, he comes out of enslavement and wants to already know that African people built civilization and wants to know more about that. And does that study, reads and writes at the highest level. It's very difficult to understand. And he's not the only one. This is happening across the across the board, but I think it goes where I open. Who are these African people on those ships? These might be the most brilliant people in the world. And so just like, of course, they're going to produce educational institutions. Of course, they're going to produce geniuses. Of course, they invented almost everything. Once they get here, they make all these inventions. Well, who were these people on these ships? Well, they had to be the most brightest people in the world. And so it's not too many places to go to try to understand how brilliant he is. Of course, his mother was brilliant and he learned from his mother and all that. But that, again, that doesn't completely explain everything. And so that's really a question that I'm still seeking to completely answer, but my answer could be right in front of me. These were brilliant African people who came, it was passed down to him, and of course he emerges as a brilliant individual because that's his bloodline, that's his birthright. That's what we do. That's how we get down. That's how we move in this world.
I think for me, it goes back to something that we talked about earlier, right? This sense of community. What is the community pouring into him, right? We know that Oliver Jones is giving him the space to be able to read, right, and educate other people. You know, one of the things that comes out of the book is that, you know, Mary Church Terrell and Woodson, right, they both are teaching at the M Street School. He goes to lectures that Arthur Schomburg is giving, and then a year later, he'll go on to create a Sala. He is in conversation. He attends a lecture by Booker T. Washington. He is attending lectures by W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So there was a community that was built around him that is really sort of pushing him forward, right? Because, you know, I think one of the things that we see within our communities, we want people to excel, right? We want people to be the best people that, you know, be the best and push forward. And so I think community really has a lot to do with pouring into who he was as a person and shaping his thinking.
And he wasn't educated by white folk who can tell him that he wasn't a genius. And so when the Freedmen Bureau comes down to the South after enslavement, they see groups of Black people on the corner with little pieces of the book with no light, learning to read. And they come down like, can we set up these schools for y'all? They're like, nah, we don't want your schools. We've been doing this since eternity. We know how to educate ourselves. There was no public educational system in the South. Black people forced that. So there was nobody there to tell you you're not good enough, or you go into a different field. You're poor and therefore you can't be smart. They didn't even though they come out of one of the worst times in human history, they have the sense of themselves and still call themselves African. Still understand themselves to be genius, even though they were working from some. That's what I think propels them into being the brilliant scholars that we see in the Du Bois and so forth, and the Martin Delaney. There's for me, no other places to go to get those explanations.
Yeah, I think you posed the question earlier, and with everything that's been said and the outline that's been provided for how African people engage education, and you know the lengths that we are willing to go through to maintain and continue our education, the question becomes in Pan-African Studies classes, why are you getting your education? What are the stakes? Because I mean, I think within this last hour, right, we laid out a very comprehensive outline of the stakes, right? And it's one thing that if you don't know these things, to sit off in these classes, but now you know what the stakes are, right? And you know why this brilliance had to become fugitive.
Yeah, I love to say that to students, right? But I know what has happened to them. And, you know, through my own work, we talk about education or schooling as a spiritual process, and really going to somebody else's school is an opportunity for them to put their spirit into you. That schools and churches are tantamount, they're equal, they have the same obligation. And so to go to a school is really going to a temple, and it's a spiritual exchange. So the students that we see before us come to us with the giant white spirit of man in them. And we got like, man, we got all these great books and this education, the MD Pass program and all of this, but it doesn't necessarily sit and resonate on their spirit because there's a white man in their spirit blocking that. And so it becomes our duty as the teacher to understand that and to reach them at that level, to begin to shake and vibrate that spirit out of them to make room for what we're dealing with. And so the meditation or the pedagogy, how I'm teaching, the passion, the call and response is not just this is to move your spirit so you can move that spirit out of the way and this spirit can come in. And that's why we teach with so much passion. We're not just teaching to your mind, we are teaching to your spirit. But the two spirits in you, we're trying to run another one out of you to open up to whatever indigenous spirit that you have and to bring that back. But sometimes, even as professors, we're like, man, why didn't I read? It's hard. But we have to remind ourselves of these things when we're teaching. How come students aren't taking advantage? We have to remind ourselves of what's going on with them.
So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, what's actually going on in these classroom spaces are exorcisms. And
that's what we should. The Pan-African studies should be about exorcism.
Exorcism. That's what's going on. Yeah.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
It should be about because what they're doing is spirit possession. They're giving you a spirit. You're speaking their language. You're eating their food. You have their names. You're shortening your names, as you talked about. You're helping them along. Because to name something, the Bible says, is to have dominion over it. So you carry their names. You're fighting for Spanish as if that's your language. You carry their names and make me try to say your names correctly with my African mind and lips. It's never gonna come out right because that's not even yet. That's not you. That's not
your name.
Don't get me started. You fighting for Spanish. That's the white man in you fighting for Spanish.
Hispanic. Before we go, though, we have about 3 more minutes. Any last comments from the audience? Any questions from the audience? If not, I want to leave the last word to Dr. Vines, if that's okay. I don't mean to put you on blast, but I think it's only apropos that we give you the last word.
Well, I'm going to take it from the book, right? Where he says, orbiting at the margins of the American schools was the Black educational heritage, where freedom dreams inherited from the enslaved became enacted in pedagogical form.
Well said. Well, we want to thank you all for joining us. It was a deeply, profoundly insightful hour for me. I hope you felt the same.
I'm dreaming of the Black Star Liners. I'm dreaming of the Black Star Liners. Out in the harbor. Out in the harbor. Waiting for you and for me to take us across.